Welcome to Shadows of the Marquis. Shadows of the Marquis is a sanctuary for lovers of intense and dramatic historical romance. Here, you'll find narrated stories that explore arranged marriages, forbidden loves, secret passions, and the eternal struggle between duty and heart. With aristocratic settings, complex characters, and raw emotions, each video transports you to a world of luxury, secrets, and redemption, where disdain can turn into desire, and love has the power to change destinies. If you're passionate about Victorian dramas, Regency plots, and immersive narratives worthy of historical novels, this is the place for you. Tonight, we bring you a tale set in the glittering winter of 1818, where Lady Rosalind Hartley, a young widow with a tarnished reputation, receives a shocking proposal from the enigmatic Duke of Ashford. He needs her to pretend to be his fiancée at the grand Christmas ball at his estate. The agreement is simple. She helps him ward off unwanted suitors and family pressure, and he offers her social protection and a generous sum of money. But there's one unbreakable rule that will change everything. Never, under any circumstances, fall in love with me. What begins as a purely transactional arrangement transforms into a dangerous game of seduction when secrets of the past collide with undeniable desire. Will they be able to maintain the charade, or will the only rule meant to protect them be exactly what destroys them? Stay with us until the end to discover how this forbidden game concludes. The opera house was nearly empty when Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ashford, found her. Lady Rosalind Hartley sat alone in a private box, her auburn hair catching the amber glow of gaslight, her emerald eyes fixed on the stage where the final notes of La Traviata dissolved into silence. She didn't turn when his shadow fell across her, though she knew he was there. She'd felt the weight of his gaze for the past 20 minutes. Lady Hartley. His voice was deep, controlled, with an edge that suggested he was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. May I have a word? Rosalind turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the way her heart stuttered. The Duke of Ashford. Everyone in London society knew of him, the ice-cold aristocrat who'd locked himself away after the tragic death of his beloved 5 years ago. His reputation preceded him. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly unapproachable. "Your Grace," she replied with practiced politeness, even as her mind raced. Why would one of England's most powerful dukes seek out a widow with whispered scandals trailing her name like ghosts? "I cannot imagine what business you could have with me." He stepped into her box without invitation, closing the door behind him. Up close, he was even more imposing than the rumors suggested. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed impeccably in black evening clothes that made his ice-blue eyes appear almost silver in the dim light. There was a hardness to his angular jaw, a scar cutting through his right eyebrow, and the faintest shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "I have a proposition for you," Alexander said, his tone businesslike, as if he were discussing a land purchase rather than whatever had brought him to seek her out. "One that will benefit us both greatly." Rosalind's fingers tightened on her fan. "I'm listening. In 8 days, I'm hosting the Christmas ball at Ashford Manor. It's the social event of the season. 200 guests, all of whom will be watching, judging, and, most importantly, trying to marry me off." His lip curled slightly in distaste. "My mother has been particularly aggressive in her matchmaking attempts. Miss Helena Fairfax has been chosen as the perfect candidate. Sweet, young, pliable." "Congratulations," Rosalind said dryly. His eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. "I need to stop this circus. And you, Lady Hartley, need social rehabilitation. The rumors about your late husband's death have made you a pariah." The words stung because they were true. Rosalind had been married for barely 6 months to Lord Edmund Hartley before he died in what was officially ruled an accident. But London society loved nothing more than scandal, and whispers of poison and murder had attached themselves to her name like barnacles to a ship's hull. "You want me to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pretend to be my fiancé," Alexander finished calmly, "for the duration of the Christmas festivities. 10 days. You'll stay at Ashford Manor, attend all functions on my arm, and convince everyone that we're madly in love. In return, I'll provide you with a generous settlement, enough to secure your future, and the protection of my name. The Duke of Ashford's betrothed cannot be easily gossiped about. Rosalind's mind spun. It was insane, impossible, and yet her creditors were circling. Her small income barely covered her modest lodgings, and the doors of polite society had been slamming in her face one by one. This could save her. "Why me?" she asked. "Surely there are dozens of women who would jump at such an offer." "Because you're believable," he said simply. "You're not a blushing debutante. You're intelligent, well-spoken, and you understand the game. More importantly, you need this as much as I do. That creates symmetry. And after the 10 days? We'll have a very public, very amicable parting. I'll ensure your reputation is restored, and we'll both go our separate ways." Rosalind studied him, searching for the trap she knew must exist. There must be conditions. For the first time, something flickered across his cold features. A tightness around his mouth, a tension in his shoulders. There is one rule, unbreakable, non-negotiable. What rule? Alexander leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely more than a murmur. "Never, under any circumstances, fall in love with me." The words hung between them like frost crystals in winter air. Rosalind's breath caught, not because the rule was romantic, but because of the raw pain she heard underneath it. This wasn't arrogance. It was self-protection. "I assure you, Your Grace," she said carefully, "my heart is quite safe. I have no interest in love." "Good. Then we have an agreement?" She should say no. Every rational bone in her body screamed that this was reckless, dangerous, a terrible idea that would only lead to more scandal. But desperation had a way of making terrible ideas seem reasonable. "Yes," Rosalind heard herself say, "we have an agreement." 3 days later, Rosalind's modest carriage rolled through gates that seemed designed to intimidate. Ashford Manor rose from the snow-covered Cotswolds like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales were written to terrify rather than enchant. The palatial Palladian structure gleamed in the winter sunlight, its cream-colored limestone walls flanked by perfectly symmetrical wings, its entrance guarded by massive columns and a double staircase of white marble. "Dear God," she whispered. The carriage stopped, and liveried footmen appeared instantly to help her down. Rosalind stepped onto the gravel drive, her traveling cloak doing little to ward off the December cold, and stared up at her temporary home. 100 rooms, 40 guest suites, 300 years of ducal history, and somewhere inside, Alexander Thorne waited to transform her into his false fiancée. "Lady Hartley," his voice came from the top of the stairs. He descended with unhurried grace, dressed in a charcoal coat and gray waistcoat, his dark hair slightly wind-blown. "Welcome to Ashford Manor, Your Grace," she murmured, curtsying. He offered his arm and she took it, trying not to notice how solid he felt, how his height made her feel almost delicate. As they climbed the stairs, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "My mother is waiting inside. She will not be welcoming. Remember, we are desperately in love." Before Rosalind could respond, the massive oak doors swung open, revealing an entrance hall that took her breath away. Marble floors in black and white, a sweeping double staircase, walls adorned with old master paintings, and standing at the center of it all, a woman whose expression could have frozen the Mediterranean. Lady Margaret Ashford was thin, rigid, dressed in burgundy silk that matched her pinched lips. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to lift her eyebrows, and her steel blue eyes raked over Rosalind with undisguised contempt. "So this is her," Lady Margaret said, her tone making it clear that her was barely a step above vermin. "The little widow with the interesting past. Mother," Alexander's voice could have cut glass. "May I present Lady Rosalind Hartley, my fiancée." The word landed like a stone in still water. Lady Margaret's face went white, then red, then white again. "You're what?" "We became engaged 3 weeks ago," Alexander continued smoothly, his arm tightening almost imperceptibly around Rosalind's. "I wanted to wait until the Christmas ball to announce it publicly, but I see no reason to hide it from family." "This is absurd. Impossible. Alexander, she's—" "The woman I love," he interrupted, and then did something that shocked Rosalind to her core. He lifted her gloved hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his ice blue eyes never leaving hers. "Isn't that right, my darling?" Rosalind's mouth went dry. They'd discussed the performance they'd need to give, but she hadn't expected him to be this convincing. Yes, she managed, her voice barely steady. Quite right. Lady Margaret looked as though she might faint or commit murder. We will discuss this privately, Alexander, now. Later, Mother. I'm sure Lady Hartley is exhausted from her journey. He turned to a hovering butler. Please show Lady Hartley to the Rose Suite. Have tea sent up. As Rosalind was ushered away by an army of servants, she glanced back once. Alexander stood watching her, his expression unreadable, while his mother hissed something viciously in his ear. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw it. The flash of something that looked almost like regret. What had she agreed to? That evening, Rosalind dressed for dinner with trembling hands. The wardrobe that had been provided was far beyond anything she'd owned since her husband's death. Silks and velvets in jewel tones, each more beautiful than the last. She chose a gown of dove-gray silk with lavender undertones, appropriate for a widow but elegant enough for a ducal dinner. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, a few artfully placed curls framing her face. When she descended the staircase, she found Alexander waiting at the bottom, resplendent in black evening clothes with a silver waistcoat. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes as he watched her approach. You look lovely, he said, offering his arm. Thank you. She took his arm, acutely aware of how many eyes were on them. Servants trying not to stare, guests arriving for the pre-Christmas festivities, and somewhere, undoubtedly, Lady Margaret plotting their downfall. The dining room was even more spectacular than Rosalind had imagined. A table that could seat 40, set tonight for 20 with crystal that caught the candlelight like captured stars, silver gleaming, and hothouse flowers arranged with artistic precision. The other guests were already assembled, minor nobility, a few politicians, distant Ashford relations, all of whom turned to stare as Alexander led Rosalind to her seat at his right hand. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander announced once everyone was seated, his voice carrying easily through the room. Allow me to introduce Lady Rosalind Hartley, my fiancé. The reaction was everything Rosalind had dreaded. Gasps, wide eyes, whispered conversations barely concealed behind raised hands. Lady Margaret, seated at the far end of the table, looked as though she was chewing glass. Congratulations, Your Grace, said an elderly gentleman after a moment. Quite unexpected news. Love often is, Alexander replied smoothly, and then turned to look at Rosalind with an expression that made her heart skip despite herself. Isn't it, darling? Indeed, she managed. The meal began, and Rosalind focused on navigating the complex social waters of ducal dining. Multiple courses, endless silverware, conversation that was half pleasantry and half interrogation. She was acutely aware of every move she made, every word she spoke, knowing that one slip could expose their charade. Midway through the third course, her hand hovered over the wrong fork. It was a small mistake, but in this company it would be noticed, evidence that she didn't truly belong in this world. Before she could correct herself, a large, warm hand covered hers, gently guiding her to the correct utensil. Alexander didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge what he'd done, simply continued his conversation with the gentleman to his left. But the touch lingered, his fingers warm through her glove, and for a moment Rosalind forgot to breathe. When he finally released her hand, she felt the loss like a physical thing. Thank you, she whispered. He turned to her then, his ice-blue eyes meeting hers, and she saw something in them that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the absence of cold. We're partners in this, he said quietly. I won't let you fail. And despite every warning bell ringing in her head, despite the rule he'd made her promise to follow, Rosalind felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest. Not love. She wouldn't call it that, but something that felt perilously close. The rule suddenly seemed much harder to keep than she'd imagined. The next morning, Rosalind woke to find snow falling softly past her windows. The Rose Suite lived up to its name, decorated in shades of blue, glacial, and silver, with a canopied bed draped in velvet and a fireplace that had been lit some time before dawn by invisible servants. Through the frost-traced glass, she could see the estate's gardens transformed into a winter wonderland, and beyond them, a frozen lake that gleamed like polished silver. A knock at her door announced the arrival of breakfast and, more surprisingly, a note written in bold, masculine handwriting. The ballroom, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. At precisely 10, Rosalind made her way through Ashford Manor's labyrinthine corridors to the grand ballroom. She'd glimpsed it briefly the night before, but nothing had prepared her for its magnificence in full daylight. 30 meters long, 15 wide, with a ceiling that soared 8 meters overhead. 3 enormous crystal chandeliers hung dark and silent now, waiting for candlelight to bring them to life. The floor was polished marble in a black and white checkerboard pattern, and tall windows looked out onto the snow-covered grounds. Alexander stood in the center of the empty space, coatless in shirt sleeves and a black waistcoat that emphasized his powerful build. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. "You're late," he said without looking at her. "I'm precisely on time. Then you should have been early." He turned, and she saw that he was holding something. A music box, she realized. Antique and beautiful. "We need to practice." "Practice what?" "Dancing." He wound the music box and the opening strains of a waltz began to fill the ballroom, tinny but clear. "At the Christmas ball, we'll be expected to lead the first waltz. Everyone will be watching. If we stumble, if we seem awkward with each other, they'll know something is wrong." Rosalind's throat tightened. She'd learned to dance as a girl, of course, but it had been years since she'd waltzed with anyone. Her late husband had considered dancing frivolous. I'm not sure I remember. I'll teach you." Alexander closed the distance between them with 3 long strides, and before she could protest, his right hand settled at her waist, his left hand capturing hers. The waltz is about connection, trust, moving as one person rather than two. The touch, even through layers of clothing, was electrifying. Rosalind could feel the heat of his palm at her waist, the strength in his fingers as they held hers. He was so close she could smell his cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and winter air. "Ready?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They began to move, and at first, it was awkward. Rosalind was too aware of him, too conscious of every step, every turn. She stumbled and his arm tightened, keeping her upright. "Don't think," he murmured. "Just feel the music. Follow me." She tried to relax, to let her body respond to his lead rather than overthinking. Gradually, miraculously, it began to work. They moved across the marble floor in perfect rhythm, spinning and gliding, and Rosalind felt something shift between them. The walls he'd built so carefully seemed to crack just a little. "You're a natural," Alexander said, and there was surprise in his voice. "I had a good teacher." She looked up at him, and their eyes met. His were no longer cold, but warm, almost tender. They continued to dance, the music box playing on, and the space between them seemed to shrink. Rosalind became hyper-aware of everything. The way his thumb brushed the small of her back, the rise and fall of his chest with each breath, the way his eyes darkened as they looked at her. "Rosalind," he said, her name a low rumble in his chest. "Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected. "When we're alone, it's Alexander." "Alexander," she repeated, and his hand tightened at her waist. They were barely moving now, simply swaying in place, and Rosalind realized with sudden clarity that they were standing far too close for propriety. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her forehead, and if she just tilted her head up. Abruptly, Alexander released her and stepped back as if she'd burned him. The music box continued its tinny waltz, but they stood frozen, staring at each other. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice rough. "You've mastered the steps, Alexander. Remember the rule, Lady Hartley." His expression had gone cold again, the Duke's mask firmly in place. "Never fall in love with me." He turned and strode from the ballroom, leaving Rosalind standing alone in the center of that vast, empty space, her heart pounding and her mind in turmoil. She'd promised to follow his rule, to keep her heart safe. But how was she supposed to do that when every moment in his presence made her feel more alive than she had in years? That afternoon, seeking escape from the confusion of her own emotions, Rosalind discovered Ashford Manor's library. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of. 2 stories of mahogany shelves lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes, twin fireplaces crackling at each end, comfortable leather chairs, and the smell of old paper and beeswax polish. She was browsing the poetry section when a portrait caught her eye. It had been turned to face the wall, clearly meant to be hidden, but curiosity got the better of her. Rosalind carefully rotated it and found herself looking at a young woman of extraordinary beauty. Golden hair, blue eyes, a smile that radiated pure joy. The portrait was inscribed at the bottom, Lady Catherine Ashford, 1811. You shouldn't have done that. Rosalind spun around to find Alexander standing in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish. For a moment they simply stared at each other, and then he walked slowly into the library, his eyes fixed on the portrait. Catherine, he said softly. My wife. I didn't know you'd been married. Most people don't. We kept it quiet. She was the daughter of a baron, not considered quite suitable by my mother's standards. We married anyway in secret, planning to announce it once Catherine was with child. But that announcement never came. His jaw clenched. She died 3 months after our wedding. Fell from her horse during a morning ride. Broke her neck. I'm so sorry, Rosalind whispered. I loved her more than life itself. When she died, I swore I'd never feel that way about anyone again. Never make myself that vulnerable. He reached out, touching the portrait with one finger. That's why I made the rule. Not to protect you, Lady Hartley, to protect myself. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and Rosalind felt tears burning her eyes. She understood now, understood the ice, the control, the rigid walls he'd built around his heart. You can't live your whole life afraid to love, she said gently. Can't I? He turned to her, his ice-blue eyes blazing. You of all people should understand. Your husband hurt you. I see it in the way you flinch when men raise their voices, in the scar on your wrist you try to hide. We're both broken, Rosalind. The only difference is I've accepted it. I don't accept it, she said fiercely. I refuse to let what he did define the rest of my life. Then you're braver than I am. They stood facing each other in the firelight, and Rosalind realized with stunning clarity that this wasn't just about completing their charade anymore. This was about 2 wounded people recognizing each other's pain and perhaps, just perhaps, finding a way to heal. Alexander stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. This is dangerous, he murmured. I know. We should stop. Yes, but neither of them moved. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone and Rosalind closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. For a moment, they existed in a bubble outside of time, outside of rules and agreements and painful pasts. Then from somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed the hour and the spell broke. Alexander dropped his hand and stepped back. Tomorrow, he said, his voice strained, we have guests arriving for the extended festivities. Lord Edmund Blackwell among them. Rosalind felt her blood run cold. Edmund? But I know who he is. Your late husband's cousin, the man who's been spreading rumors about you across London. Alexander's expression hardened. I invited him deliberately. Keep your enemies close, as they say. But you need to be prepared. He'll try to cause trouble. Why would you invite someone like that? Because I want to watch him, and because if we can weather his attempts to sabotage us, no one will ever question our engagement again. He moved toward the door, then paused. Rosalind, that portrait, leave it turned toward the wall. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. After he left, Rosalind did as he asked, rotating the portrait of Catherine back to face the wall. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that some ghosts couldn't be hidden away forever. Eventually, they always found a way to haunt the living. The next day dawned clear and cold, and by afternoon, Ashford Manor was bustling with new arrivals. Carriages rolled up the drive in a steady stream, disgorging lords and ladies in their finest traveling clothes. The manor transformed from a quiet residence into a glittering social spectacle, filled with laughter, music, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Alexander had been called away to greet the more important guests, leaving Rosalind to navigate the social waters alone. She was standing near one of the tall windows in the drawing room, watching the snow-covered grounds and trying not to feel overwhelmed, when a cheerful voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be Lady Hartley." Rosalind turned to find a young woman approaching with a warm smile. She was petite and blonde, dressed in a pale pink gown that made her look like a china doll. Helena Fairfax, the woman Alexander's mother had chosen as his perfect bride. "Miss Fairfax," Rosalind said carefully. "Oh, please call me Helena. We're going to be friends, I just know it." The young woman's enthusiasm seemed genuine, without a trace of malice. "I must confess I'm terribly relieved about your engagement to the Duke." "Relieved?" "Well, yes. Everyone assumed I was destined to marry him, but the truth is, we'd make a dreadful match. He's far too serious for me, and I'm far too silly for him. Besides," she leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I'm desperately in love with Mr. Thomas Caldwell, the vicar's son from my village. Of course my parents would never approve. He has no money or title, so this takes all the pressure off me." Despite herself, Rosalind smiled. "That's very practical of you." "I try to be." Helena linked her arm through Rosalind's as if they'd been friends for years. "Now you simply must tell me everything. How did you and the Duke meet? When did he propose? I want all the romantic details." Before Rosalind could fabricate a suitable answer, a new voice cut through the drawing room chatter like a knife. "Lady Hartley." What an unexpected pleasure. Rosalind's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Turned slowly to face the man who'd made her life in London unbearable. Lord Edmund Blackwell had once been handsome, but excess and cruelty had taken their toll. His face was flushed from too much wine. His waistcoat strained over a growing stomach, and his eyes, those calculating amber eyes, held nothing but malice. "Lord Blackwell," she managed. "I was surprised to receive an invitation to the Duke's Christmas festivities. Even more surprised to hear about your engagement." He practically sneered the last word. "Tell me, does His Grace know about your interesting past? About the circumstances of poor Hartley's death?" Helena's grip on Rosalind's arm tightened protectively. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Lord Blackwell. Don't you?" Edmund stepped closer, his voice dropping but not quite low enough to be private. "It's rather remarkable how men seem to die when they get too close to Lady Hartley, isn't it? One might almost think she's dangerous. One might also think," Alexander's voice came from behind Edmund, cold and deadly, "that spreading malicious gossip about a duke's fiancée is an excellent way to find oneself thrown out into the snow." Edmund spun around, his face going pale. "Your Grace, I was merely attempting to cause trouble." Alexander moved to stand beside Rosalind, his presence a shield. "A word of advice, Blackwell. Choose your battles more carefully. You won't win this one." For a moment, Edmund looked as though he might argue. Then, evidently thinking better of it, he bowed stiffly and retreated. But as he left, Rosalind caught the expression on his face. Pure hatred mixed with cunning. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked quietly. "Yes, thank you." He studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "Come, let's get some air." They excused themselves from the drawing room, Alexander leading her through the manor's corridors with practiced ease. They wound up in a glass-enclosed garden room, the orangery, he called it. Exotic plants flourished despite the winter cold outside, creating a lush green oasis that smelled of citrus and jasmine. A marble fountain bubbled in the center, and wrought iron benches painted white offered places to sit. "This was Catherine's favorite room," Alexander said quietly, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at a potted lemon tree. "She used to say it was like having summer all year round. It's beautiful." "Edmund Blackwell is dangerous, Rosalind. More dangerous than you realize. The rumors about your husband's death, are they true?" Rosalind felt her throat constrict. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the question she couldn't answer without revealing everything. "My marriage," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "was not what it appeared. Lord Hartley was charming in public, but in private, he had a terrible temper. He drank too much, and when he drank, he became violent." Alexander turned to face her fully, his ice-blue eyes intent on hers. "The night he died, we'd argued. He'd been drinking whiskey all evening, and when I refused to submit to his demands, he became enraged. He grabbed me, threw me against the wall. Her hand unconsciously moved to her wrist, to the thin scar hidden beneath her glove. I fought back. I pushed him away. He stumbled, fell, hit his head on the fireplace hearth. An accident, Alexander said. The coroner ruled it such. But Edmund, Lord Hartley's cousin, was convinced I'd murdered him. He wanted the estate, you see. When I inherited instead, he began spreading rumors, trying to get me arrested for murder. The whispers followed me everywhere. No one would receive me. I became a ghost in my own life. And that's why you agreed to this arrangement. I was desperate. I am desperate. She looked up at him, tears threatening. I need you to know I'm not a murderer, Alexander. I'm not dangerous. I was just trying to survive. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, deliberately, he reached for her left hand and began to peel off her glove. Rosalind let him, holding her breath as he exposed the thin white scar on her wrist, the evidence of that terrible night. You were defending yourself, he said, his thumb brushing over the scar with infinite gentleness. That's not murder. That's survival. You believe me? I believe you. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. And I'll make sure everyone else does too. Edmund Blackwell won't hurt you again, I promise. The vulnerability of the moment, the tenderness in his touch, was too much. Without thinking, Rosalind stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding beneath her palm as rapid as her own. Alexander, she whispered. This is a bad idea, he said, but he didn't move away. A terrible idea. We agreed to the rule. I know, but they were moving closer anyway, drawn together by something neither could name or resist. His hand slid from her wrist to her waist, pulling her against him. His other hand cupped her face, tilting it up toward his. Rosalind, he breathed, his lips hovering inches from hers. If we do this, we can't pretend it means nothing. Then let's not pretend. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and desperate, a collision of two people who'd been denying themselves for too long. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that took her breath away, his arms wrapping around her as if he feared she might disappear. Rosalind melted into him, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, every coherent thought dissolving in the heat of the kiss. They broke apart only when breathing became necessary, both of them gasping, foreheads pressed together. The rule, Alexander said hoarsely. I think we just broke it. God help us both. He kissed her again, softer this time but no less passionate, and Rosalind knew with absolute certainty that their carefully constructed charade had just become devastatingly real. The line between performance and truth had vanished, and neither of them had any idea what to do about it. The next 3 days passed in a blur of increasingly elaborate festivities. More guests arrived daily, until Ashford Manor was filled to capacity with aristocrats, politicians, and social climbers, all eager to witness the Duke of Ashford's legendary Christmas ball. The manor itself was transformed, every room decorated with pine garlands and holly, red velvet ribbons and gold-painted pine cones, candles everywhere casting warm, flickering light. But beneath the festive atmosphere, tension simmered. Edmund Blackwell watched Rosalind like a predator stalking prey, his hatred barely concealed. Lady Margaret grew increasingly hostile, her attempts to sabotage the engagement becoming more desperate. And Rosalind and Alexander, they danced around each other, pulled together by desire and pushed apart by fear. They'd kissed twice more since that first encounter in the orangery, once in the library late at night when they'd both been unable to sleep, and once in an alcove off the main hall when they'd stolen a moment alone. Each kiss was more dangerous than the last, each touch making it harder to remember why they'd made their foolish rule in the first place. The night before the Christmas ball, Rosalind sat at the escritoire in her room, trying to write a letter to her solicitor about her financial affairs, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Alexander, his kiss, his touch, the way he looked at her when he thought no one else was watching. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Helena Fairfax entered, her expression more serious than Rosalind had ever seen it. "I needed to talk to you. Privately." "Of course. Please sit." Helena settled on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap. "I know you and the Duke are pretending." Rosalind's heart stopped. I don't know what you... Please don't insult my intelligence. I've watched you both for days now. The way you look at each other when you think no one is watching, that's real. But the performance you give for the crowd? That has the feel of something rehearsed. Helena leaned forward. I don't care about your reasons. But I wanted to warn you, Lord Blackwell knows too. Or suspects at least. And tomorrow night at the ball he's planning something. What kind of something? I don't know exactly. I overheard him talking to another guest about revealing the truth and exposing frauds. Whatever he has planned, it's meant to humiliate you publicly. Rosalind felt ice settle in her stomach. I need to tell Alexander. There's something else. Helena's voice dropped even lower. I think what you and the Duke have, whether it started as pretense or not, has become real. I've seen the way he looks at you, Rosalind. That man is falling in love whether he admits it or not. And you're in love with him too. I'm not. Don't lie to yourself. I may be young, but I'm not blind. Helena reached out and squeezed Rosalind's hand. Tomorrow night, when Lord Blackwell makes his move, you're going to have to decide what's more important. Protecting yourself, or protecting what you and the Duke have built together. Choose carefully. After Helena left, Rosalind sat in the firelight, her mind racing. Was it true? Had she fallen in love with Alexander despite every promise, every rule, every logical reason not to? Yes, her heart whispered. Yes, you have. The morning of the Christmas ball dawned clear and cold, the estate covered in fresh snow that gleamed like diamonds in the winter sun. Rosalind woke early, her stomach in knots, and spent the day in a haze of preparation. A lady's maid appeared to help her dress, bringing with her a gown that took Rosalind's breath away. It was emerald green velvet, the exact shade of her eyes, with a low neckline and cap sleeves. The bodice was embroidered with golden thread in patterns that resembled ivy and holly, and the skirt fell in heavy, luxurious folds. With it came long white gloves, a delicate gold necklace with an emerald pendant, and matching earbobs. His Grace had it made specially, the maid said as she helped Rosalind into the gown. He said the color reminded him of life returning to the garden in spring. Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes. The gift was too personal, too thoughtful for a false engagement. This was a man who saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. By the time she descended the grand staircase at 8 o'clock, the ball was already in full swing. The ballroom blazed with light from 3 enormous chandeliers holding hundreds of candles, the crystal prisms casting rainbow sparkles across the black and white marble floor. The massive Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with red velvet ribbons, gold baubles, and tiny candles that flickered like captured stars. 200 guests filled the space, ladies in jewel-toned silks and satins, gentlemen in black evening clothes. The cream of English society gathered to witness the Duke's grand announcement. Alexander stood at the bottom of the stairs waiting for her. He was magnificent in a black tailcoat and silver waistcoat, his dark hair perfectly styled, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. You're breathtaking, he said when she reached him, offering his arm. The dress is beautiful, thank you. It's not the dress. His fingers tightened on hers. Rosalind, before we go in there, I need to tell you something. What is it? But before he could answer, Lady Margaret appeared, her expression thunderous. The guests are waiting, Alexander. You're already late. They had no choice but to enter the ballroom. A hush fell as they stepped through the doors, 200 pairs of eyes turning to watch. Alexander led Rosalind to the center of the floor, the orchestra falling silent. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander's voice rang out clear and strong. Thank you for joining us for Ashford Manor's Christmas Ball. Before the dancing begins, I have an announcement to make. Lady Rosalind Hartley has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife. Our engagement is no longer a secret but a celebration. The crowd erupted in polite applause, though Rosalind could see the shocked faces, the whispered conversations. Lady Margaret looked as though she might collapse. Edmund Blackwell, standing near the back of the crowd, wore a smile that made Rosalind's blood run cold. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Alexander pulled Rosalind into his arms. They began to dance just as they'd practiced in this very room days earlier, but everything was different now. Then they'd been strangers playing roles. Now they were two people desperately, terrifyingly in love, pretending not to be. They moved across the floor with perfect synchronization, spinning and gliding, and Rosalind forgot about the watching crowd, forgot about Edmund's threats, and Lady Margaret's hatred. There was only Alexander, his hand at her waist, his eyes locked on hers, the rest of the world fading away. "You're magnificent," he murmured as they turned. "I wish this could be real." "It is real," she whispered back. "Can't you feel it?" "Rosalind." But he never finished the sentence, because at that moment Edmund Blackwell's voice cut through the music like a knife. How touching! The murderous widow and the heartbroken duke. What a perfect match! The orchestra stumbled to a halt. Alexander and Rosalind stopped mid-turn, frozen in each other's arms. Edmund stepped forward from the crowd, slightly unsteady from drink, his face flushed with malicious triumph. "Shall I tell everyone the truth, Lady Hartley? Or would you prefer to do it yourself?" "Blackwell." Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "Leave. Now. Not until everyone knows what kind of woman you're marrying. She murdered my cousin in cold blood, poisoned him and made it look like an accident." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rosalind felt Alexander's arms tighten protectively around her, but she stepped away from him, drawing herself up to her full height. "Lord Hartley was not poisoned," she said clearly. "He fell, hit his head. The coroner ruled it an accident. Because you bribed him." Edmund's voice rose. "I have proof. Letters you wrote to my cousin before his death threatening him." "Those letters," Rosalind said, her voice shaking but determined, "were pleas for him to stop drinking, to stop hurting me. I have the bruises to prove what kind of man your cousin really was. Lies, all lies." "Enough." Alexander's voice cut through the chaos like thunder. He moved to stand beside Rosalind, his hand finding hers. "Lord Blackwell, you've made some serious accusations. But before we discuss them further, perhaps you should know that I've spent the past week investigating you as well." Edmund's face went pale. "You... what? Did you really think I'd accept Lady Hartley's hand without learning everything about her past? Including the men who've tried to destroy her?" Alexander's smile was cold and sharp. "I know about your gambling debts, Edmund. The ones you hope to pay off with your cousin's estate. I know about the forged documents you created to try to claim that inheritance. And I know about the witnesses who are prepared to testify that on the night of Lord Hartley's death, you were seen lurking outside his townhouse. Some might say waiting for an opportunity." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Edmund looked wildly around, seeing his accusation turning back on him. "You're lying. I have statements, documentation, all prepared by my solicitors." Alexander's voice dropped to something dangerous. "So here's what's going to happen, Edmund. You're going to apologize to Lady Hartley. You're going to leave this house, and you're never going to speak her name again. Because if you do, I'll make sure every door in London society slams in your face. You'll be ruined, just as you tried to ruin her." Edmund opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His face had gone from red to white to an alarming shade of purple. Finally, seeing no escape, he turned to Rosalind. My apologies, Lady Hartley. I spoke in haste. Get out," Alexander said softly. Edmund fled, practically running from the ballroom. The silence he left behind was deafening. 200 guests stared at Alexander and Rosalind, waiting to see what would happen next. Lady Margaret stepped forward from the crowd, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Alexander, is it true? You investigated Lord Blackwell?" "I did. I investigated everyone connected to Rosalind's past, because I needed to know the truth." He turned to face the assembled crowd, still holding Rosalind's hand. "Lady Hartley's late husband was a violent man who died in an accident. The rumors of murder were manufactured by a bitter relative seeking to claim an inheritance that wasn't his. I have all the proof anyone could need." "And you still wish to marry her?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't wish to marry her," Alexander said, and Rosalind felt her heart stop. Then he turned to her, his ice blue eyes blazing with an emotion that took her breath away. "I need to marry her. Because I've broken the only rule I ever made. I've fallen in love with her." The ballroom erupted in gasps and exclamations, but Rosalind heard none of it. She was staring at Alexander, tears streaming down her face. as he dropped to one knee before her in front of 200 witnesses. "Rosalind Hartley," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This started as a charade, a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way it became the most real thing in my life. I know I'm damaged. I know I'm difficult. But I love you with everything I am. And if you'll have me, truly have me not as part of a performance but as your husband, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice." "Alexander," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him, not caring about the beautiful dress or the watching crowd. "You said never fall in love with you, but I did. I fell so hard I don't know how to get up again." "Then don't get up. We'll stay here together." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Say yes. Please say yes." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then in front of everyone, a kiss that held nothing back. Not passion or love or desperate relief. The ballroom erupted in applause, but they didn't hear it. There was only each other, only this moment, only the truth they'd finally stopped running from. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Lady Margaret was crying, actually crying, and even she had to admit defeat. "Welcome to the family, Lady Hartley," she said stiffly, then added more softly, "Rosalind." Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the manor blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled like sugar in the morning sun. Most of the guests had departed after the drama of the ball, leaving behind only a few close friends and family. Rosalind woke to find a note on her pillow, "Meet me by the frozen lake." She dressed quickly in a warm wool dress and cloak, then made her way through the snow-covered gardens. Alexander stood by the lake's edge, his dark coat stark against the white landscape. When he heard her approach, he turned and smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind she'd thought him incapable of when they first met. "Good morning, my love," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Good morning." She nestled against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. "What are we doing out here? It's freezing." "I wanted to show you something." He led her to a small wooden bench that overlooked the frozen expanse of water. "Catherine and I used to come here in the winter. She loved ice skating." Rosalind tensed slightly. "Alexander, let me finish." He turned to face her, his hands holding hers. "I loved Catherine. I always will, in a way. But I understand now that holding on to that love, that grief, was killing me. I was frozen. Just like this lake. Beautiful, perhaps, but lifeless. Cold." He touched her face with infinite tenderness. "You melted me, Rosalind. You brought me back to life. And Catherine, I think she would have liked you. I think she would have wanted this for me. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. You're not replacing anyone. You're creating something entirely new." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I had this made for you. Not for the charade, not for the performance. For you, for us. For the future we're going to build together." He opened the box to reveal a ring, an emerald surrounded by diamonds, set in gold. It was exquisite, and so perfectly suited to her that Rosalind felt fresh tears threatening. "It's the exact color of your eyes," Alexander said softly, slipping it onto her finger. "The color of life returning after winter. The color of hope." "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect. I'm not. But with you, I want to try to be." They sat together on that bench as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the frozen world around them. In the distance, Ashford Manor stood like a fairy tale castle, its windows gleaming with promise. And for the first time in 5 years, Alexander could imagine a future filled not with grief and ghosts, but with love and laughter and life. "What happens now?" Rosalind asked. "Now?" Alexander pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now we plan a real wedding. We tell the truth to everyone, that yes, it started as pretense, but it ended as the most real thing either of us has ever known. We face down my mother's continued disapproval. We build a life together. We love each other without rules or restrictions or fear. That sounds perfect. There's one more thing." He smiled mischievously. "I need to teach you to ice skate." "What? Now?" "Why not?" He stood, offering his hand. You trusted me to teach you to waltz. Trust me with this too." Laughing, Rosalind let him pull her onto the frozen lake. They spent the next hour spinning and sliding and falling and laughing. Two people who'd been broken by the past, learning to move forward into the future together. Later, much later, after they'd returned to the warmth of the manor and changed into dry clothes, Alexander pulled her into the library for a private moment. The room was empty except for them, the fire crackling cheerfully and Catherine's portrait still turned to face the wall. "Should we?" Rosalind gestured toward the painting. "Yes," Alexander said firmly. "It's time." Together, they turned the portrait around, setting Catherine's smiling face back where it belonged. Alexander stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he took Rosalind's hand. "Thank you," he said to the portrait, his voice thick with emotion, "for loving me, for teaching me what love could be, and for letting me find it again." Then he turned to Rosalind, pulling her into his arms. "And you," he murmured against her hair, "thank you for breaking all my rules, for seeing past the ice to the man underneath, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Always," Rosalind promised. "I'll love you always." They kissed there in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and the gentle blessing of the past releasing them to their future. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, covering the world in white. A blank page waiting for their story to be written. And it would be a beautiful story, Rosalind thought. A story of two broken people who found each other in the midst of a charade and discovered that the greatest love stories often begin with a lie that becomes truth. Of a widow who learned to trust again, and a duke who learned that love was worth the risk of losing it. Of a Christmas ball that changed everything, and a single rule that was meant to be broken. As Alexander deepened the kiss, his hand tangling in her auburn hair, Rosalind sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever fate had brought them together. She'd come to Ashford Manor desperate and alone, willing to pretend at love for the sake of survival. She was leaving engaged to a man she truly loved, with a future brighter than any she dared imagine. The charade was over. The truth had won. And love, as it always does, had found a way. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Leave a like to support our work. Share in the comments what you would do if you were in the character's place. Your opinion might appear in the next video. Thank you for being part of Shadows of the Marquise. Until our next story, may your days be filled with passion, your nights with mystery, and your heart with the kind of love that changes everything.